Joachim George Kroll was born on April 17, 1933, in Hindenburg, a town in Upper Silesia, Germany, during a time of deep economic hardship and war. He was the youngest of 8 children in a poor family. His father was a miner, stern and distant, and Joachim grew up during the Second World War surrounded by famine, destruction, and fear. His family lived in cramped conditions. Food was scarce, and his childhood was shaped by deprivation. This period of hunger and violence would leave scars that later twisted into darker obsessions. From an early age, Joachim was considered slow and socially awkward. Teachers described him as dull and withdrawn. He struggled with schoolwork, often wet the bed well into adolescence, and was bullied by other children. He spoke in a halting manner, had little confidence, and rarely made friends. These isolations pushed him inward, where he developed strange habits and fantasies. He became fixated on animals, and by his teenage years, he was known to kill them in disturbing ways. When he reached adulthood, Kroll found simple jobs as a farmhand and factory worker. He never advanced, never married, and never built a normal social life. His co-workers remembered him as strange, but harmless, a man who stayed mostly silent, shuffled when he walked, and seemed to live in his own world. But beneath the quiet exterior, Joachim was developing urges he could no longer control. In 1955, at the age of 22, Kroll committed his first known murder. His victim was a young woman named Irmgard Strell. He attacked her in the town of Wallstedt, strangled her, and then mutilated her body. For Joachim, the act was not only about violence, but also about fulfilling twisted desires linked to domination and consumption. Investigators at the time failed to connect him to the crime. With little suspicion on him, Joachim slipped back into his life of obscurity. Over the next 2 decades, Kroll embarked on a series of killings that spread fear across the Ruhr region of West Germany. His victims were mostly women and young girls, chosen randomly. He stalked parks, riversides, and isolated paths, waiting for the vulnerable moment when someone walked alone. He would strangle them quickly, then assault and mutilate their bodies. His crimes often included acts of cannibalism. When food was scarce during his childhood, he had developed disturbing associations between survival and flesh. As an adult, these associations returned in horrifying ways. The murders happened sporadically, with years sometimes passing between attacks. This inconsistency made it extremely difficult for investigators to link the crimes. Police in different towns handled the cases separately, and in several instances, innocent men were arrested and even convicted for murders actually committed by Kroll. The real killer remained unnoticed, living quietly in his small apartment, working simple jobs, and blending into the background of society. Neighbors considered him odd, but not dangerous. He lived alone, collected rubber dolls, and was often seen wandering with no clear purpose. He never formed close relationships and spent most of his evenings in isolation. Yet, at night, his darker impulses would drive him to stalk the streets in search of victims. By the 1970s, the murders became increasingly brutal. Victims included young girls whose disappearances shocked their communities. Parents kept their children close, women avoided walking alone, and police patrols increased in wooded areas. But Joachim continued to elude capture. His simple, unassuming appearance and lack of sophistication helped him blend in perfectly. Few could imagine that this quiet, unimpressive man was responsible for such horrors. His final crime, however, would bring everything to an end. In July 1976, a young girl named Marion Ketter disappeared near her home in Duisburg. Witnesses reported seeing her last in the vicinity of Joachim Kroll's apartment. Police, desperate after years of unsolved murders, began searching the area. When they entered Kroll's residence, they were met with a scene that confirmed their worst fears. Inside, they found parts of Marion's body. In the kitchen, pieces of human flesh were stored as if they were ordinary food. In the bathroom, investigators discovered remains blocking the pipes. Kroll admitted calmly that he had been flushing portions of the body down the toilet. The discovery shocked even seasoned detectives. For years, West Germany had been haunted by these mysterious killings, and now the truth was exposed. Kroll was arrested on the spot and taken into custody. During questioning, He confessed without much resistance. In his halting, simple way of speaking, he admitted to killing at least 14 people over 2 decades, though authorities believe the real number could be higher. The trial began in 1982. It was one of the most disturbing trials in German criminal history. Kroll sat quietly in court, often appearing confused or detached. He described his crimes in a flat, emotionless manner, showing little understanding of their horror. His defense argued diminished responsibility due to his intellectual limitations, but the scale and brutality of his acts were undeniable. In April 1982, Joachim Kroll was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. He was sent to a high-security prison, where he lived out the rest of his life under constant supervision. In 1991, at the age of 58, he died of a heart attack behind bars. The case of Joachim Kroll left a permanent mark on Germany. His crimes were not only acts of violence, but of unimaginable depravity, and they revealed the failures of the investigative system at the time. Innocent men had paid the price for murders he committed, and for decades, families lived in fear of an unseen predator who walked quietly among them. For those who knew him, Joachim Kroll was a man of little presence, almost invisible in daily life. Yet beneath the surface, he carried some of the darkest impulses imaginable. His story remains one of the most haunting examples of hidden evil, a reminder that sometimes the most unassuming individuals can hide the deepest horrors. Next story. Harold Frederick Shipman was born on January 14, 1946, in Nottingham, England. He was the second of 4 children in a working-class family. His father was a lorry driver, while his mother, Vera, was a strict and dominant presence in his life. She favored Harold above his siblings, nurturing a special bond with him. For young Harold, his mother's approval meant everything, and her influence shaped much of his personality. As a boy, Shipman was quiet, intelligent, and somewhat reserved. Teachers noted his academic promise, but he never stood out socially. He often seemed serious, older than his years. During his teenage years, tragedy struck the household. His mother developed terminal lung cancer. Harold, then only 17, was deeply affected by her decline. He watched her suffer with immense pain, but he also witnessed doctors administering morphine to ease her final days. The image of his mother slipping in and out of consciousness under the effects of the drug became etched in his memory. On June 21st, 1963, Vera Shipman died. For Harold, the experience was devastating, but it also introduced him to the quiet, clinical power of medicine to end suffering and life. After his mother's death, Harold pursued medicine. He attended medical school at Leeds University, where he met his future wife, Primrose. They married while he was still a student, and over the years, the couple had 4 children. Outwardly, they seemed like a typical English family. Behind closed doors, though, Harold was increasingly controlling, demanding obedience from his wife and expecting silence about his habits. Shipman graduated as a doctor in 1970 and began practicing medicine in northern England. Early in his career, colleagues noted both his competence and his arrogance. He often clashed with other doctors, believing his judgment superior. By the mid-1970s, he had developed a troubling addiction to pethidine, a powerful painkiller. He was caught forging prescriptions and forced to undergo a rehabilitation program. Though this scandal could have ended his career, he managed to recover professionally and continued practicing. By the 1980s and 1990s, Shipman had established himself as a trusted general practitioner in Hyde, a small town near Manchester. Patients saw him as a reliable family doctor, a man who made home visits, listened to concerns, and provided comfort. But behind the mask of respectability, Shipman had begun to kill. He targeted primarily elderly women, often widows who lived alone. He would visit them in their homes or see them in his surgery, then administer lethal doses of morphine, medical heroin. To families, it seemed their loved ones had passed peacefully in their sleep. Shipman encouraged cremation, and because he signed the death certificates himself, suspicions were avoided. Over time, his patient list became a graveyard. Local undertakers began to whisper about the unusually high number of deaths, among Shipman's patients. Other doctors, too, noticed patterns, but the respect afforded to a doctor, combined with the difficulty of proving foul play, allowed him to continue unchecked. In 1998, the case that broke his facade began. Kathleen Grundy, a healthy and wealthy 81-year-old widow, was found dead at home. Shipman had been the last person to see her alive. When her will was read, it stunned her family. It left her entire estate, almost £400,000, to Harold Shipman. Suspicious, her daughter, a lawyer, contacted police. Kathleen's body was exhumed, and forensic tests revealed fatal levels of morphine. Shipman had killed her and tried to profit from it. When investigators searched Shipman's practice and computer, they uncovered forged medical records and a chilling pattern of deaths. The scale of his crimes began to emerge. He was arrested in September 1998. His trial began in 1999, and the evidence was overwhelming. In January 2000, Harold Shipman was convicted of 15 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment. But his crimes extended far beyond what was proven in court. The Shipman Inquiry, an official investigation, later concluded that he had murdered at least 215 patients, with suspicions of many more. Some estimates place his total number of victims at over 250, making him the most prolific serial killer in recorded history. Unlike many killers who sought notoriety or confessed to their acts, Shipman remained cold and silent. He never admitted guilt, never explained his motives. Psychologists speculated that his need for control, rooted in the trauma of his mother's illness, may have driven him to decide who lived and who died. Others saw his actions as arrogance taken to the extreme, a belief that he had the right to play God. In prison, Shipman showed no remorse. He spent his days withdrawn and bitter. On January 13, 2004, the day before his 58th birthday, he was found hanging in his cell at Wakefield Prison. He had taken his own life, denying families the chance for answers. Harold Shipman's crimes shook Britain profoundly. He shattered the sacred trust between patient and doctor, turning the symbol of care into one of death. His story forced sweeping changes in medical practices, including tighter controls on prescribing drugs and stricter oversight of death certifications. Yet the true horror lies in the quiet way he operated for decades. No dark alleys, no frenzied chases, only a man in a white coat, carrying a black bag, walking into the homes of the vulnerable and leaving behind silence. Next story. Edmund Emil Kemper was born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California. From the moment of his childhood, troubling signs were visible. His father, Edmund Jr., was a World War II veteran who later worked in nuclear testing, while his mother, Clarnell, was a harsh, domineering woman. The household was full of tension. Clarnell belittled her son constantly, calling him useless, mocking his size, and insisting he would never succeed. As a boy, Kemper was already unnerving to those around him. At 10, he buried the family cat alive. Later, he killed another cat with a knife and kept its head as a trophy. These early cruelties revealed the darkness already forming inside him. Standing over 6 feet tall before reaching adulthood, Edmund towered over his peers, yet inside he remained deeply insecure and angry. At age 15, after years of abuse at home, he ran away to live with his father. When that failed, he was sent to live with his grandparents on a ranch in North Fork, California. The arrangement quickly soured. His grandmother was strict and often argued with him, and his grandfather was distant. In August 1964, after an argument in the kitchen, Kemper picked up a rifle and shot his grandmother dead. When his grandfather returned home, Kemper killed him as well, later saying he didn't want his grandfather to see what had happened. He was arrested immediately and sent to a psychiatric facility. At only 15, he was declared criminally insane and diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Yet, during his years of confinement, doctors noted his intelligence. With an IQ measured at around 145, Kemper impressed staff with his manners and insight. By the age of 21, he convinced psychiatrists that he was rehabilitated. Despite killing both grandparents, he was released into the custody of his mother in Santa Cruz, California. Living again with his mother proved disastrous. Clarnell remained abusive, verbally attacking him, calling him pathetic, and forbidding him from socializing with women. Kemper developed an intense hatred for her, but suppressed it, turning instead to fantasies of domination and murder. By the early 1970s, he began acting on those fantasies. Standing at 6'9" and weighing nearly 300 pounds, Kemper was physically imposing, but he used a gentle voice and polite manner to put people at ease. He started picking up female hitchhikers, a common practice in California at the time. At first, he drove them safely to their destinations, rehearsing how he would kill them. Soon, practice turned into action. In May 1972, he murdered 2 Fresno State students, Mary and Pesci and Anita Lucchesa, after picking them up. He drove their bodies to a secluded area, strangled them, and later dismembered their remains. That August, he struck again, killing Aiko Koo, a 15-year-old dancer who had missed her bus. He abducted her, strangled her, and hid her body. Over the next year, the killings continued. In January 1973, he picked up Cindy Shaw, a college student, and shot her. He later dismembered her body in his mother's bathtub and disposed of it in the ocean. In February, he killed Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu after giving them a ride near the University of California, Santa Cruz. Their remains were also discarded by the roadside and in remote areas. Kemper's pattern was chilling. He would pick up young women, kill them, and bring their bodies back to his mother's house. There, he engaged in necrophilia, dismemberment, and other acts of desecration. Despite the brutality of his crimes, no one suspected him. He was friendly with local law enforcement officers, even drinking at the same bar as many detectives. They considered him harmless, a gentle giant who just liked to talk. The final murder came in April 1973, when Kemper turned on the source of his deepest rage, his mother. After an argument late at night, he bludgeoned her with a hammer and slit her throat. He then mutilated her body, cutting off her head and using it for disturbing rituals. Afterward, he killed his mother's best friend, Sally Hallett, to create an alibi. With both women dead in the house, Kemper drove away to Colorado. On the way, he listened to news reports about the murders. Knowing the manhunt would soon begin, he decided to end it himself. From a phone booth in Pueblo, Colorado, he called the police and confessed in detail to the killings. At first, officers thought it was a prank, until he told them where to find the bodies. Edmund Kemper was arrested without resistance. During his trial, he confessed calmly and openly, giving chilling accounts of the murders. His intelligence and articulate manner shocked the courtroom. He was convicted of 8 murders and sentenced to life imprisonment in 1973. In prison, Kemper became a model inmate. He recorded audiobooks for the blind, maintained good behavior, and cooperated with psychologists. Yet he remained an unnerving figure, openly describing his crimes in interviews with a disturbing lack of emotion. To this day, he is housed in California Medical Facility, where he has spent more than 50 years. The case of Edmund Kemper continues to fascinate criminologists and the public alike. His combination of towering physical size, high intelligence, and unimaginable cruelty makes him one of the most notorious killers in history. Beneath the quiet, polite exterior, he carried the rage of a lifetime of abuse, and he unleashed it on innocent young women who trusted him for a ride. His story remains one of the darkest chapters of American true crime, a reminder of how easily evil can hide in plain sight. Next story. Henry Lee Lucas was born on August 23, 1936, in Blacksburg, Virginia, into a world that offered him very little warmth. His early life was dominated by a chaotic and abusive household. His mother, Viola, was an unstable and often violent woman, and his father was largely absent, leaving young Henry without guidance or protection. As a small child, he endured beatings and emotional cruelty that left deep psychological scars. The fear and isolation he felt shaped the man he would later become, and it instilled in him a sense of resentment and anger that simmered quietly beneath the surface. From an early age, Henry displayed troubling tendencies. He He became aggressive toward other children and animals, often harming them in ways that alarmed those around him. By adolescence, he had begun committing petty thefts, breaking into homes, and lying to avoid punishment. Yet, despite the chaos at home and his increasingly erratic behavior, he remained a small, unassuming boy physically, which would later help him avoid suspicion. He learned quickly how to manipulate adults, to charm them just enough to escape consequences. When Henry was a teenager, his life took a darker turn. He was sent to live with other relatives at times, and he drifted between households, never finding stability. He began experimenting with alcohol and small-scale criminality, finding in the act of transgression a thrill and a sense of power he lacked in his home life. During this period, he also started to fantasize about harming others. The fantasies were at first vague and secretive, but they grew in intensity as he became more comfortable with deceit and manipulation. As a young adult, Lucas began a life of drifting. He traveled widely across the United States, moving from city to city with no fixed address. He took temporary jobs, lived in cheap motels, and occasionally stayed with friends or acquaintances he met along the road. This nomadic lifestyle made him nearly invisible to law enforcement for years. He could strike in one location and vanish before anyone noticed, leaving no trace but tragedy. Lucas's crimes began in earnest in the late 1960s and continued intermittently for decades. His victims were often vulnerable: hitchhikers, young women, men he met at truck stops, and occasionally members of families he encountered while wandering. He lured them with promises of work, friendship, or shelter, creating a sense of trust that allowed him to isolate them. Once he had control, his methods varied. He would strangle, bludgeon, or stab his victims, sometimes leaving them bound or in hidden areas. He occasionally mutilated bodies, but his primary goal seemed to be the act of control itself, rather than notoriety or financial gain. One of the most chilling aspects of Lucas's crimes was his confessions. In the 1980s, he began to speak to authorities about his acts, often in graphic detail. He claimed responsibility for hundreds of murders spanning multiple states, though investigators struggled to confirm the majority. Some of his confessions were clearly false, meant to inflate his reputation or manipulate investigators. Yet others were disturbingly accurate, including specific details about locations, methods, and victims that only the killer could know. This combination of truth and deception baffled law enforcement for years. In the late 1980s, Lucas was finally caught in Texas after being linked to multiple murders in the state. Police had long suspected him in the killing of his mother-in-law, Viola Lucas, whose death had been suspicious but never fully investigated. In addition, the disappearance of a young woman named Lucille Pruitt brought investigators to him. Through a combination of witness statements, forensic evidence, and Lucas's own confessions, authorities were able to piece together a clearer picture of his crimes. He was convicted of multiple murders in Texas, including the deaths of his mother-in-law and Lucille Pruitt, and sentenced to death. While on death row, Lucas continued to talk about his crimes, sometimes in chillingly casual ways. Psychologists examined him extensively, noting his manipulative tendencies, lack of remorse, and the complex mixture of charm and menace that had allowed him to evade capture for so long. Despite decades of investigation, the full extent of his killings may never be known, leaving many families with unanswered questions and unresolved grief. Lucas died in prison on March 12, 2001. He had spent the last years of his life behind bars, but the impact of his crimes stretched far beyond prison walls. His story is remembered as one of the most disturbing examples of a drifter who preyed on strangers across the United States. He was not motivated by fame, wealth, or ideology. He killed because he could, because it fulfilled a dark need for control and power that had been cultivated since childhood. The legacy of Henry Lee Lucas is a stark reminder of the dangers that can emerge from a combination of childhood trauma, psychological disturbance, and unchecked opportunity. He moved silently, leaving communities shaken and families destroyed. The randomness of his crimes, the sheer breadth of his movement, and the difficulty investigators faced in linking his acts all contribute to the chilling nature of his story. For criminologists, true crime enthusiasts, and those fascinated by the dark recesses of a human mind, Lucas remains a haunting figure. A man whose life of drifting concealed a deadly compulsion, and whose story continues to intrigue, terrify, and fascinate. Next story. Alexander Pichushkin was born on April 9th, 1974, in Moscow, Russia. From the outside, his childhood appeared ordinary, but inside his home there were shadows. He was a quiet boy, often withdrawn, and his family noticed that he had trouble fitting in with other children. His father abandoned the family when Alexander was very young, leaving him in the care of his mother and grandparents. When he was still a small child, he fell from a swing, striking his forehead against a metal frame with great force. Doctors at the time believed the injury was minor, but later experts would suggest that this blow damaged the frontal lobe of his brain. That area controls impulses, decision-making, and emotions. The injury may have planted the seed for the violent urges that grew within him. His mother sent him to live with his grandfather for a time. This move gave him some stability, but also exposed him to loneliness and isolation. His grandfather noticed Alexander's withdrawn nature and encouraged him to take up chess. The game fascinated him. He discovered that he had a sharp mind for strategy and logic. He spent hours studying the board, moving pieces, calculating moves ahead. To him, chess was more than a game. It was a system of control, a battlefield he could dominate. This obsession would later fuse with his darkest fantasies. When his grandfather died, Alexander's world collapsed. He returned to live with his mother, but the loss crushed him. He became more withdrawn and angry, often drinking heavily even as a teenager. He never found a sense of belonging with classmates. Bullied and mocked, he turned inward, brooding, carrying resentment. By the early 1990s, Moscow was a city in flux. The Soviet Union had collapsed, leaving crime, poverty, and lawlessness in its wake. It was in this chaotic backdrop that Pichushkin began to kill. His first known attempt came in 1992. He lured a young boy he knew into a building and pushed him from a window. The boy died, but the murder was treated as an accident. Pichushkin escaped suspicion, and in his mind, he had discovered how easy it was to take a life. For years afterward, he remained quiet. He worked at a grocery store and kept a low profile. But by the early 2000s, his urges could no longer be contained. He began targeting people in Bedtime Park, a sprawling wooded area on the edge of Moscow. Many of his victims were elderly men, alcoholics, or homeless people. He approached them with offers of vodka, companionship, or simply a walk. Once alone with them in the park, he struck them from behind, often using a hammer. Afterward, he sometimes shoved a vodka bottle or a stick into the victim's skull through the wound. Each killing, for him, was part of a larger plan. He wanted to murder 64 people, one for each square on a chessboard. He kept track of his victims as though they were pieces in a game, reducing human lives to numbers in his private contest against the world. What made Pichushkin particularly terrifying was his lack of remorse. In later confessions, he spoke of killing as though it gave him clarity and strength. He compared murder to drinking a glass of water. Each act made him feel alive, powerful, and more in control. Throughout the early 2000s, bodies began to appear in Bedtime Park. Moscow police struggled to connect the dots. Many victims were marginalized people whose disappearances raised little alarm. Investigations stalled, and Pichushkin continued. He killed with increasing frequency, sometimes multiple times in a week. By 2005, whispers of a maniac in Bedtime Park spread. Locals avoided the woods at night. Still, police failed to catch him. Pichushkin grew bolder, even targeting women. In one case, he killed a colleague from the grocery store. Unlike many of his other victims, she was reported missing immediately. Investigators traced her last known whereabouts, eventually leading them to Alexander Pichushkin. In June 2006, authorities arrested him. In custody, he stunned detectives with his confessions. He calmly admitted to dozens of murders, explaining his chessboard plan. He claimed that his true number of victims was 61, far higher than the official tally. He described his methods without hesitation, almost proudly. His trial in 2007 captured national attention. In court, Pichushkin showed no remorse. He smiled, smirked, and even interrupted proceedings. For the families of the victims, his lack of humanity was unbearable. In October 2007, he was convicted of 48 murders and 3 attempted murders, making him one of Russia's most prolific serial killers. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment, with the first 15 years to be served in solitary confinement. Today, Alexander Pichushkin sits behind bars in a Russian prison, isolated from the world he once hunted. He remains a chilling figure, remembered not only for the sheer scale of his crimes, but for the cold, methodical way he carried them out. His legacy is one of horror, a reminder of how a human mind can transform life and death into nothing more than moves on a board. Next story. Robert Christian Hansen was born on February 15, 1939, in the small farming town of Esterville, Iowa. His father was a Danish immigrant who had come to America to build a stable life. He opened a bakery, and from the very beginning, he demanded discipline, responsibility, and obedience from his children. Robert grew up in this strict household where work came before everything else. From his earliest years, Robert was different from other children. He was painfully shy, soft-spoken, and struggled with a stutter that made him the target of cruel jokes. His acne was severe, scarring his face as he entered adolescence. Classmates teased him for his appearance, and every stumble in his speech brought more laughter. School, for most children, was a place to learn and to play. For Robert, it was a place of humiliation. When he wasn't at school, he was working. His father insisted he spend long hours helping in the bakery, waking before dawn to knead dough, carry sacks of flour, and serve customers. The smell of fresh bread filled the air every morning, but for Robert, the bakery was not a place of comfort. It was a place of obligation, where mistakes were not tolerated. He grew up with the weight of expectation pressing down on him. As he entered his teenage years, Robert retreated further into himself. He found it difficult to connect with girls. Whenever he tried, his stutter betrayed him, his acne embarrassed him, and his shyness kept him isolated. He began to develop a simmering resentment toward women. He wanted their attention, but he felt invisible. He wanted their affection, but he was mocked instead. These feelings festered quietly, turning into dark fantasies of revenge. To escape his loneliness, Robert turned to hobbies that didn't require social skills. He learned to hunt. Alone in the woods, rifle in hand, he felt a sense of control he never had around people. He stalked animals patiently, waiting for the perfect shot. Each successful hunt gave him confidence that eluded him in daily life. The wilderness became his sanctuary. It was here that he began blending two worlds, the shame of rejection and the thrill of domination. In 1960, when Robert was 21, his anger boiled over. He set fire to a school bus garage, burning down 3 buses. For this act of arson, he was arrested and sentenced to prison. During his time behind bars, psychologists noted that he had bipolar disorder and antisocial tendencies. But the seriousness of his condition was brushed aside. After serving just 20 months, he was released. Robert tried to start over. He married, divorced, and then remarried. He maintained steady work, returning to the bakery trade, and tried to appear as a normal man. But beneath the surface, his old resentments and fantasies lingered. In the late 1960s, Robert and his second wife moved to Alaska, settling in Anchorage. The move was meant to be a fresh start. Anchorage at the time was a frontier city, rough around the edges but filled with opportunity. Robert opened a bakery of his own, and before long, he became a familiar figure in the community. Customers described him as polite, hard-working, even generous. He provided bread and pastries for neighbors, coached at a local archery club, and raised 2 children with his wife. On the surface, he was an ordinary family man, but his private world told a different story. He continued hunting, and his skill in the wilderness grew legendary. He held records for trophy animals, including moose and sheep, and proudly displayed them. His reputation as a hunter gave him respect, something he had never known in his youth. But his hunting was not confined to animals. In the isolation of Alaska, where vast wilderness stretched for hundreds of miles, Robert found the perfect setting for his darkest fantasies. During the 1970s, Anchorage saw a growing sex trade. Bars, clubs, and streets were filled with women working as dancers or sex workers, many of them transient, with no close ties to the community. To Robert, these women were invisible, just as he had once felt invisible. They became his targets. Robert developed a method that combined his two worlds, his resentment toward women and his skill as a hunter. He would approach women with offers of money or by threatening them with a weapon. Once they were under his control, he transported them to his remote cabin or into the wilderness. There, his ritual began. He would sometimes assault them, sometimes restrain them for hours, but eventually he released them into the forest. With his hunting rifle or bow in hand, he pursued them like prey. He stalked them through the trees, watching them stumble over roots and cry out in terror. For Robert, this was the ultimate hunt. He controlled the terrain, the weapons, and the outcome. When he decided the chase was over, he killed them, leaving their bodies buried in shallow graves scattered across the Alaskan landscape. For years, women disappeared around Anchorage. Some bodies were found, others vanished completely, their remains hidden in the vast wilderness. Police noticed the pattern but struggled to identify a suspect. Robert Hansen was the last man anyone would expect. He was a baker, a father, a churchgoer, and a respected hunter. His quiet demeanor hid the predator inside him. In 1983, his crimes began to unravel. A young woman named Cindy Paulson was abducted by Robert. She endured hours of assault, chained and threatened, but when he left her briefly unattended, she seized her chance. Still in shackles, barefoot and terrified, she escaped and ran into the streets. She flagged down a truck driver, who helped her reach the police. Cindy's account was detailed and consistent. She described Robert Hansen's appearance, his car, his home, and the weapons he had used. At first, investigators hesitated. Hansen had no history that fit the profile of such a violent predator. But Cindy's testimony could not be ignored. Detectives began to dig deeper. They discovered inconsistencies in Hansen's alibis and obtained a search warrant for his home. What they uncovered confirmed Cindy's story. Hidden in his property were trophies belonging to missing women, jewelry, identification cards, and other personal items. Most chilling of all was a map. On it, Robert had marked dozens of locations deep in the Alaskan wilderness. Each X represented a burial site. Faced with the evidence, Robert eventually confessed. He admitted to abducting women, releasing them into the wild, and hunting them down. He described the thrill of the chase, the power he felt as his victims fled through the trees, and the satisfaction of killing them. He claimed at least 17 victims, but investigators believe the true number could be closer to 30. In 1984, Robert Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. His quiet life as a baker and community man was exposed as a facade, hiding one of the most sadistic killers in American history. He died in 2014, still imprisoned, leaving behind unanswered questions about how many lives he truly ended. To this day, the story of Robert Hansen haunts Alaska. The wilderness, once a place of freedom and beauty, became his hunting ground. The women who vanished into the trees are remembered not only for the horror they endured, but for the silence that allowed him to kill for more than a decade. Next story. Gary Leon Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949, in Salt Lake City, Utah. He was the second of 3 sons in a working-class family. His father, Thomas Ridgway, worked as a bus driver, while his mother, Mary, was a retail sales clerk. The family lived a modest life, struggling financially at times, but always trying to maintain appearances of normalcy. From the outside, their household seemed unremarkable, yet within its walls lay tensions and patterns of dysfunction that would later be seen as critical to the making of a killer. As a child, Gary was shy and slow to develop academically. He struggled with reading comprehension and was held back in school more than once. Teachers noticed that he seemed detached, often staring off or failing to grasp lessons. His classmates sometimes mocked him for his lack of intelligence, and he grew up with a deep sense of inferiority. This sense of being less than others would stay with him for life, shaping the way he related to people. At home, the Ridgway family environment was strained. Gary's father often complained about sex workers, speaking of them with contempt. He frequently shared disturbing stories about encounters he had witnessed while driving his bus route near Seattle, where prostitution was common. At the same time, Gary's relationship with his mother was complicated. She was described as domineering, strict, and sometimes humiliating toward him. Gary later spoke of feeling confused by his mother's behavior, especially when she scolded him harshly, even as she also cared for him physically in ways that left him with troubling, conflicted emotions. As Gary entered adolescence, he began to show troubling signs of suppressed rage. At the age of 16, in what would later be remembered as a shocking foreshadowing of his adult crimes, he lured a 6-year-old boy into the woods and stabbed him. The child survived, but the act revealed a dangerous side of Gary that no one around him truly recognized or understood at the time. It was brushed off as an isolated incident, and Gary moved forward with his life as though nothing had happened. After finishing high school, Gary joined the Navy. He was deployed to Vietnam, where he was exposed to the chaos of war and the widespread use of sex workers among soldiers. He contracted gonorrhea during his service, which filled him with a mixture of guilt and anger, emotions that later became tied to his view of women. When his military service ended, he returned to the United States and settled near Seattle. Gary Ridgway married young, taking a woman named Claudia Craig as his first wife in 1970. But their marriage was troubled from the beginning. He was jealous, controlling, and consumed by suspicions of infidelity. His fixation on sexual activity was overwhelming, and his expectations in the marriage were exhausting to his partner. They divorced within a year. He would marry more than once again, and in each relationship he displayed a disturbing pattern of obsession, control, and infidelity. On the surface, Ridgway lived a seemingly ordinary working-class life. He was employed as a painter at the Kenworth Truck Factory, where he remained for decades. His co-workers described him as quiet, sometimes odd, but generally reliable. He attended church regularly and sometimes read the Bible aloud at home. Yet beneath this facade of normalcy, he was nurturing dark fantasies and behaviors that would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in history. The murders that would later be attributed to him began in the early 1980s in the area surrounding the Green River near Seattle. In 1982, the body of a young woman was found in the river. Within weeks, more bodies were discovered, all of them women, many of them known to be sex workers or runaways. The victims were often strangled, sometimes with ligatures, and their bodies were left in wooded areas, ravines, or the river itself. The pattern became clear to investigators. They were dealing with a serial killer who targeted vulnerable women, lured them to his vehicle, murdered them, and then disposed of their bodies in clusters across the landscape. The press soon dubbed him the Green River Killer, a name that would haunt the Pacific Northwest for decades. The investigation quickly became one of the largest in American history. Task forces were formed, dozens of detectives and FBI profilers were assigned, and yet the killer remained elusive. Ridgway himself was interviewed as early as 1983. He admitted to knowing some of the victims and to picking up sex workers, but he was calm, cooperative, and passed a polygraph test. Without concrete evidence, the investigators let him go. Meanwhile, the bodies continued to accumulate. Throughout the 1980s, women kept vanishing from the Seattle area, many of them last seen near Pacific Highway South, a stretch of road notorious for prostitution. Their remains were later found in clusters in wooded dumping sites that Ridgway returned to more than once. He often revisited the corpses to perform acts of necrophilia, an element of his crimes that remained hidden until his eventual confessions. For years, the task force chased leads, investigated suspects, and tried new forensic methods. Among those who assisted was Robert Keppel, a detective who had previously investigated Ted Bundy. Bundy himself, sitting on death row in Florida at the time, even offered to help profile the Green River Killer. Bundy suggested that the killer likely revisited the bodies and that he chose vulnerable women because he knew their disappearances would draw less attention. At the time, investigators considered Bundy's insights, but still lacked the evidence to make an arrest. Ridgway's double life continued into the 1990s. He remarried, held his job steadily, and maintained a bland suburban existence. Neighbors described him as unremarkable, sometimes friendly, sometimes odd. Few suspected that the quiet man who mowed his lawn and attended barbecues was hiding the darkest of secrets. The break in the case came with the advancement of DNA technology. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, samples that had been preserved from the victims were tested using new methods. Semen found on several victims was matched conclusively to Gary Ridgway. In 2001, nearly 2 decades after the first murders, Ridgway was finally arrested. The arrest shocked those who knew him. Many could not reconcile the ordinary factory worker with the monstrous crimes. In custody, Ridgway eventually confessed to an astonishing number of murders. He admitted to killing at least 70 women, though he was only formally convicted of 49. His confessions revealed chilling details. He spoke matter-of-factly, with no visible remorse, explaining how he chose women he thought no one would miss, how he strangled them in his truck or home, and how he returned to their bodies long after their deaths. In 2003, Ridgway accepted a plea bargain that spared him the death penalty in exchange for full cooperation. He led investigators to previously undiscovered remains and described his methods in cold detail. The families of the victims attended hearings, listening as he recounted the deaths of their loved ones. For many, it was a devastating experience, but it also brought answers after decades of uncertainty. Ridgway was sentenced to life in prison without parole, serving his time at the Washington State Penitentiary. He remains there to this day, one of the most prolific serial killers in United States history. Story 2. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois, into a blue-collar family of Polish and Danish descent. His father, John Stanley Gacy, was a World War I veteran and auto repair machinist who carried the scars of alcoholism and a violent temper. His mother, Marion, was described as a kind and protective woman who tried to shield her children from the worst of their father's anger. John Wayne, known in the family simply as Johnny, was the second of 3 children, with 2 sisters who were close to him throughout his life. From an early age, Gacy's relationship with his father was one of fear and disappointment. The elder Gacy often belittled his son, calling him weak and stupid, mocking him for not being athletic, and sometimes beating him for minor infractions. Johnny longed for approval that never came. Even as he grew older and achieved small successes, his father dismissed him. His mother, on the other hand, offered him compassion and defended him from his father's abuse. But this only deepened the wedge between father and son. As a boy, Gacy suffered from health problems. He experienced fainting spells and was later diagnosed with a congenital heart condition that limited his ability to participate in sports. This weakness made him a target of bullying from peers and further scorn from his father, who saw physical strength as a mark of manhood. These early wounds of rejection and humiliation would stay with him for life. Despite his struggles, Gacy showed an ability to charm and make friends. He had a sociable nature and often tried to win people over with humor and friendliness. By his teenage years, he became active in community organizations, working in grocery stores, and showing leadership qualities that impressed many around him. Yet behind this affable exterior, he carried secrets of confusion about his identity, his desires, and his insecurities. After finishing high school, Gacy moved through a series of jobs, eventually finding work in management positions. He married his first wife, Marlyn Myers, in 1964, and the couple settled in Waterloo, Iowa, where her family owned a chain of Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants. Gacy managed 3 of these restaurants, earning a good salary and presenting himself as a respectable young businessman. He joined the JCs, a civic organization where he rose quickly through the ranks, known for his enthusiasm and his ability to get others involved. But beneath this respectable exterior, Gacy harbored dark impulses. In 1968, he was charged with sexually assaulting a 15-year-old boy, an offense that shattered the image he had worked so hard to build. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and his wife divorced him, taking their 2 children and severing all ties. After serving just 18 months, Gacy was released in 1970 for good behavior. He returned to Chicago, determined to rebuild his life, but the seeds of his future crimes had already been planted. Back in Chicago, Gacy reinvented himself. He started a successful construction business, PDM Contractors, which specialized in painting, decorating, and maintenance. He remarried, this time to a woman named Carol Hoff, a divorced mother with 2 daughters. They moved into a house on Somerdale Avenue in Norwood Park, a quiet suburban neighborhood. To his neighbors, Gacy appeared to be a model citizen. He hosted parties, often cooking elaborate meals, and became involved in local Democratic Party politics. One of Gacy's most unusual hobbies was performing as a clown. He created 2 characters, Pogo the Clown and Patches the Clown, sewing the costumes himself and painting his own face. He entertained children at hospitals, charity events, and parades, earning him the nickname the Killer Clown in later years. To those who saw him perform, he seemed harmless, even joyful. Yet this persona masked the terrifying reality of what was happening inside his home. Throughout the 1970s, young men and boys began disappearing in the Chicago area. Many of them were runaways, drifters, or youth-seeking work. Gacy often lured them with promises of construction jobs or money. Some he picked up hitchhiking, others he met at bus stations or on the street. Once inside his home, he would offer them alcohol or show them a trick involving handcuffs, claiming he could demonstrate how to escape. When they were restrained, he revealed his true intentions. He assaulted them, strangled them, and disposed of their bodies. The sheer number of victims is staggering. Over the years, Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys. He buried most of them in the crawl space beneath his house, layering the bodies in trenches that he dug himself. Others were disposed of in the nearby Des Plaines River. His ability to maintain his public image while committing these crimes is one of the most disturbing aspects of his story. Suspicion grew slowly. Some families of the missing reported seeing their sons last with Gacy, and rumors circulated. In 1978, the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest became the turning point. Piest was last seen at a pharmacy where Gacy had offered him a job. When he failed to return home, his parents alerted the police, who quickly connected his disappearance to Gacy. A surveillance operation was launched. Detectives followed Gacy, noting his erratic behavior and eventually obtaining a search warrant for his home. What they discovered shocked them. The smell of decomposition in the house was overwhelming. In the crawl space, they began to find bodies, one after another, buried in the earth. The scale of the crime was almost beyond comprehension. Gacy was arrested in December 1978. During questioning, he confessed in chilling detail to the murders. He spoke casually of how he killed the boys, describing them as if they were objects rather than human beings. The trial began in 1980 and lasted for weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, while the defense tried to argue insanity. But the jury was unmoved. Gacy was found guilty of 33 murders, the largest number attributed to one person in United States history at that time. He was sentenced to death. For years, he lived on death row at Menard Correctional Center, appealing his sentence and maintaining at times that he was innocent, at other times admitting to the crimes. He became a notorious figure, even creating paintings that were sold for high prices by collectors morbidly fascinated with him. On May 10th, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Crowds gathered outside the prison, some celebrating, others reflecting on the horror of his crimes. His last words were dismissive, showing no remorse for the lives he had taken. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy's crimes left a deep scar on the Chicago community and the families of his victims. His ability to live a double life, to be a businessman, a community volunteer, and a clown who entertained children, while at the same time burying dozens of bodies beneath his home, remains one of the most chilling examples of hidden evil. His case also led to greater awareness of the need for better investigations into missing persons, especially those from vulnerable groups. Story 3. The story of Peter Sutcliffe, later known to the world as the Yorkshire Ripper, begins in a quiet and ordinary setting, one that gave little hint of the darkness that would one day emerge. Born in Bingley, West Yorkshire, in 1946, Sutcliffe grew up in a working-class family in post-war England. His early life was marked by a somewhat withdrawn personality, a boy who seemed more comfortable in solitude than in crowds. Teachers and peers noticed that he was shy and sometimes awkward, but there was little outward sign of what was to come. The landscape of his childhood was one of smoky industrial towns, strict social structures, and families trying to rebuild their lives in the aftermath of war. As Sutcliffe grew older, those who knew him recalled a young man who seemed caught between the ordinary expectations of life and a deeper sense of disconnection. He worked various jobs, including in a factory and later as a truck driver, but he never seemed to settle. His relationships were strained, though he eventually married Sonia Surma in 1974, a woman who would remain by his side through much of the turmoil that was to follow. Their marriage was unusual, marked by long separations and a lack of intimacy, which only deepened Sutcliffe's sense of isolation. The crimes that would bring his name into infamy began in the mid-1970s. Between 1975 and 1980, women in the north of England began to be attacked with shocking brutality. Many were sex workers, living vulnerable lives on the margins of society. Others were simply ordinary women going about their daily routines. The killings were marked by a distinctive pattern, with the use of a hammer and a sharpened instrument that inflicted terrible injuries. The attacks were sudden, frenzied, and deeply violent, leaving behind scenes of horror that confounded the police and terrified the public. The press quickly seized upon the fear, labeling the unknown killer the Yorkshire Ripper, an echo of the Victorian-era Jack the Ripper murders in London. The name stuck, and with it came a wave of public panic. Women across the north of England lived under a shadow of dread, avoiding nighttime travel, staying in groups, and fearing the possibility that the next victim could be anyone. The climate of fear grew so severe that it reshaped social life, particularly for women, and placed immense pressure on law enforcement to find the culprit. The investigation, however, was plagued by mistakes. The West Yorkshire Police launched one of the largest manhunts in British history, interviewing thousands of men, compiling endless files of information, and struggling under the weight of both public expectation and their own internal errors. A major setback came in the form of the so-called Wearside Jack hoax. A man with a strong Sunderland accent sent letters and tapes to the police claiming to be the killer. The police, convinced of the authenticity of the recordings, diverted significant resources to focus on suspects with similar accents. In reality, the letters and tapes were fraudulent, later proven to have been sent by John Samuel Humble, a man with no connection to the actual murders. This misdirection allowed Sutcliffe to continue his killings while the investigation drifted off course. By the end of the decade, the list of victims had grown. Women such as Wilma McCann, Emily Jackson, Irene Richardson, Patricia Atkinson, Jane MacDonald, and many more had lost their lives in horrifying circumstances. Some victims were young women with children, others elderly, some students or shop assistants. Each case carried with it grief and devastation for families and communities, while the broader society lived with the constant unease of not knowing when or where the killer would strike next. Despite being interviewed by the police multiple times, Sutcliffe managed to avoid capture. He explained away inconsistencies, charmed his way out of suspicion, and benefited from the disorganization of the investigation. Files were misplaced, connections were overlooked, and the sheer scale of the inquiry left gaps through which Sutcliffe slipped repeatedly. The frustration of the detectives mounted, and the anger of the public grew. Women's rights groups organized protests, demanding greater safety and accountability, and criticizing the police for failing to protect the vulnerable. The breakthrough finally came in January 1981. Sutcliffe was arrested in Sheffield after police officers noticed false number plates on his car. Inside the vehicle, they discovered tools that connected him to the series of murders. Further investigation revealed bloodstains, weapons, and other evidence that left little doubt as to his guilt. Once in custody, Sutcliffe confessed to many of the murders, speaking in a detached and almost casual manner that shocked investigators. He claimed that he had been commanded by voices, a supposed divine directive to rid the world of prostitutes. Whether this was a genuine delusion or an attempt to craft a defense is still debated, but it became a central element of his trial. In May 1981, Sutcliffe stood trial at the Old Bailey. The proceedings gripped the nation as the court heard testimony about the murders, the botched investigation, and Sutcliffe's mental state. His defense argued diminished responsibility, claiming he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. However, the jury rejected this, and Sutcliffe was convicted of 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder. He was sentenced to 20 concurrent life terms in prison, a sentence later upgraded to a whole life tariff, ensuring that he would never be released. The aftermath of the case left lasting scars on British society. Families of the victims struggled with grief for decades, while the surviving victims bore the trauma of their attacks. The failures of the police investigation led to a major public inquiry, which criticized the West Yorkshire police for their mishandling of the case and recommended sweeping reforms. The Wearside Jack hoaxer was eventually unmasked and imprisoned years later, adding another tragic dimension to the story of misdirection and lost lives. Sutcliffe himself spent the rest of his life in custody, moving between prisons and psychiatric facilities. He was attacked several times by fellow inmates and lived under heavy guard. His health declined in later years, and he died in 2020 after contracting COVID-19, bringing an end to the life of a man whose crimes had cast a shadow over an entire generation. The story of the Yorkshire Ripper remains one of the most haunting chapters in British criminal history. It is a tale not only of violence and cruelty, but also of systemic failure, public fear, and the resilience of those who demanded justice. It reveals how the actions of one man can alter the lives of countless others, and how institutions meant to protect can falter under pressure. For decades, it has served as a cautionary reminder of the need for vigilance, fairness, and the protection of society's most vulnerable. Story 4. The story of Richard Ramirez, who would become infamously known as the Night Stalker, begins far from the bright lights of Los Angeles, in El Paso, Texas, where he was born in February 1960. He grew up in a troubled household, the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Mexican-American family. His father was strict and often abusive, and young Richard, called Richie by his family, began spending long hours away from home to avoid conflict. He slept in cemeteries as a child, he wandered the streets at night, and he grew up surrounded by influences that were anything but stable. From an early age, Ramirez was exposed to violence and darkness that would shape him forever. His older cousin, Miguel, was a Vietnam veteran who returned from the war with photographs of atrocities and stories of brutality. Miguel would show these images to the impressionable boy and brag about acts of violence he committed overseas. Even more horrifying, Miguel once shot his wife in front of Richard, an act of domestic murder that Ramirez witnessed firsthand as a teenager. This exposure to blood and death left a deep imprint. Ramirez's adolescence spiraled further into delinquency. He experimented with drugs, including LSD, and developed a fascination with Satanism, black magic, and horror. He idolized serial killers and murderers, studying their crimes as if they were role models. By his late teens, he was committing burglaries, drifting between jobs, and spending nights wandering city streets. Eventually, he left Texas for California, where the anonymity of Los Angeles provided the perfect landscape for his descent into crime. The wave of violence that earned him his place in history began in 1984. The first known murder linked to him was that of Jenny Vincow, a 79-year-old woman who was brutally attacked in her Los Angeles apartment. Her death bore the hallmarks of the savagery that would characterize many of his crimes: forced entry, overwhelming violence, and sexual assault. At first, the murder seemed isolated, but within months, the pattern grew. In 1985, Los Angeles was gripped by terror. Ramirez embarked on a spree of home invasions, murders, rapes, and assaults that appeared almost random in their targets. He attacked the young and the elderly, men and women, people of different races and backgrounds. No one felt safe because there was no clear profile of who might be next. He entered homes at night, often through unlocked windows or doors, and his victims woke to unspeakable violence. Some were shot, others stabbed, many bludgeoned. He left behind scenes of horror that investigators struggled to connect at first, but soon the public and police alike realized they were facing one of the most sadistic criminals in modern American history. Ramirez developed a ritualistic pattern. He used guns, knives, or blunt objects. He often assaulted women sexually, sometimes in front of their partners or children. He forced his victims to swear to Satan, leaving behind pentagrams drawn in lipstick or carved into skin. The press seized on these satanic connections, fueling fear that the Night Stalker was not merely a murderer, but part of something even darker. The city of Los Angeles descended into paranoia. Hardware stores sold out of locks and guns. People double-bolted doors, installed alarms, and slept with weapons nearby. The heat of the summer in 1985 made this even more difficult, as residents kept their windows closed in fear. Every creak of the night became a cause for panic. The randomness of Ramirez's targets made him particularly terrifying. Unlike other killers who focused on specific types of victims, Ramirez struck without pattern, so no one felt safe. The police worked tirelessly, but Ramirez proved elusive. He used stolen cars, switched weapons, and left behind little that could lead directly to him. He killed in Los Angeles, but also traveled north to San Francisco, committing murders there as well, widening the scope of the hunt. A breakthrough came when a fingerprint lifted from a stolen car matched Richard Ramirez, whose criminal record included prior arrests. His face was soon plastered across newspapers and television screens, and the entire state knew his name. The capture of Richard Ramirez was almost cinematic in its drama. In August 1985, a resident in East Los Angeles recognized Ramirez from a newspaper photo. By chance, Ramirez had entered a local store and noticed his own face staring back at him from headlines. He attempted to flee, but was chased by a group of local residents. They cornered him, beat him, and held him down until police arrived. The Night Stalker had been brought down not by elite detectives, but by ordinary citizens who refused to let him escape. His trial was one of the most sensational in American history. Beginning in 1989, it stretched on for months, marked by shocking testimony, graphic evidence, and Ramirez's own disturbing behavior. He frequently flashed a pentagram drawn on his hand, shouted "Hail Satan" in court, and showed no remorse. His demeanor made him both feared and strangely idolized. Some followers wrote him love letters and attended his trial, drawn to his image as a dark antihero. But for the families of his victims, the trial was an agonizing ordeal, forcing them to relive the horrors inflicted by a man who seemed to revel in their pain. Ultimately, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. The evidence was overwhelming, and the jury sentenced him to death. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he would remain for the rest of his life. Even in prison, Ramirez remained a figure of fascination and revulsion. He married a woman who had written to him while incarcerated, though their relationship eventually faded. He lived under the shadow of execution for more than 2 decades, appealing his conviction but never escaping his fate. In 2013, before his death sentence could be carried out, he died of complications related to B-cell lymphoma, ending his life behind bars. The legacy of Richard Ramirez's crimes is one of terror, sorrow, and unanswered questions. His victims and their families live with scars that never fully heal. The communities he terrorized remember the summer of 1985 as a time when fear was constant, when the Night Stalker seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. His case also changed the way Americans understood crime, highlighting the vulnerability of ordinary households and the randomness of violence. The Night Stalker remains a chilling symbol of predatory cruelty, a man whose actions revealed the darkest corners of human capability. His story endures not because of who he was, but because of the devastating impact he had on countless innocent lives, and a reminder of how fragile safety can be when confronted with evil. Story 5. The story of Dennis Lynn Rader, who became known to the world as the BTK Killer, begins in the small city of Wichita, Kansas, a place that for many years felt far removed from the kind of horrors that would eventually unfold there. Dennis Rader was born in March of 1945 in the tiny community of Pittsburgh, Kansas, before his family eventually moved to Wichita. From the outside, he seemed to grow up in an ordinary Midwestern household, with both parents working hard to provide for their children. Yet even in his childhood, troubling patterns began to emerge. He later admitted that from a young age he experienced violent sexual fantasies, often imagining scenarios where he bound and controlled women. These fantasies never disappeared. Instead, they grew stronger as he matured, becoming the foundation for the crimes that would terrorize Kansas for decades. Rader graduated from high school in 1963 and spent a brief time in college before enlisting in the United States Air Force. He served from 1966 until 1970, and after returning to Kansas, he attempted to live what looked like an ordinary life. He married his wife Paula in 1971, settled down in the Wichita area, found steady work first in a meat packing plant and later with an outdoor supply company, and eventually became a compliance officer for the city of Park City, a suburb of Wichita. He was also active in his church congregation, even serving as president of the church council. To neighbors and colleagues, he seemed strict and somewhat odd, but far from dangerous. No one could have imagined the hidden life he was leading. The first known murders attributed to Rader occurred in January of 1974, when he entered the home of the Otero family in Wichita. Inside were Joseph and Julie Otero and two of their young children. What unfolded that morning was an act of unimaginable violence. Rader bound each member of the family with cords and methodically killed them one by one. The brutality of the Otero murders stunned Wichita and immediately led police to believe a highly dangerous individual was at large. Yet investigators had few leads. There were no suspects, no clear motive, and no connection between the victims and a possible killer. The Otero murders might have remained an isolated tragedy, but soon afterward Rader made it clear he wanted recognition. In October of 1970, a local newspaper received a letter from someone claiming responsibility. The letter described details of the crime scene that only the killer could know. Most chillingly, the writer signed the letter with the initials BTK, standing for bind, torture, kill. That phrase would become inseparable from the crimes and the identity of the man who committed them. Over the following years, Rader struck again. In April 1974, he killed Catherine Bright, a young woman he attacked in her home after following her. 2 years later, in March 1977, he murdered Shirley Vian, a mother whose children he locked in a bathroom while he carried out the crime. In December of that same year, he killed Nancy Fox, an attack he later called one of his most significant. Rader continued to taunt police and media through letters and poems, always signing them BTK. His communications revealed a desire for notoriety and control. He wanted to ensure his crimes would not be forgotten and that his name would instill fear. Despite the communications, investigators struggled to identify the killer. The crimes appeared carefully planned, and the letters revealed a disturbing intelligence. Task forces were formed, tips poured in, but the identity of BTK remained elusive. By the early 1980s, Rader seemed to go quiet. In reality, he had not stopped having violent fantasies, but he began spacing out his attacks, making them harder to connect. In April 1985, he murdered Maureen Hedge, a neighbor who lived just down the street from him. He later confessed to hiding her body in the church where he served as council president, posing her in different positions before disposing of her remains. In September 1986, he killed Vicki Wegerle, leaving behind her husband as the one to find her bound and strangled. At the time, police did not realize this crime was connected to BTK, and it was only later confirmed through DNA evidence. His final known murder occurred in January 1991, when he killed Dolores Davis, again abducting her from her home and leaving her body in a rural area outside Wichita. After that, Rader appeared to go dormant. For more than a decade, there were no known BTK murders, and many in Wichita began to believe the killer had either died or moved away. During this time, Rader continued living his outwardly normal life. He raised 2 children, maintained his job as a compliance officer where he enforced petty city codes with almost obsessive rigor, and remained active in his church. Those who knew him described him as strict, rule-bound, and somewhat controlling, but nothing that pointed to a secret double life as a serial killer. Then in 2004, more than 30 years after the first Otero murders, Wichita received a shock. BTK resurfaced. A local television station received a package containing photographs and a copy of Vicky Wedrell's driver's license, stolen from the crime scene years earlier. This was undeniable proof that the killer was still alive and wanted attention once again. Over the next year, a series of communications arrived at media outlets and police, all from BTK. He sent packages containing crime scene items, letters describing his actions, and puzzles meant to taunt investigators. These new communications proved to be Rader's undoing. In one package, he asked police if they could trace information from a computer floppy disk. Investigators responded publicly through a newspaper ad suggesting it would be safe. When Rader eventually sent a floppy disk, forensic analysis revealed metadata linking the document to Christ Lutheran Church and the name Dennis Rader. Investigators quickly confirmed that DNA taken from Rader's daughter matched evidence preserved from earlier crime scenes. On February 25, 2005, Dennis Rader was arrested near his home in Park City. The news stunned the community. This man who had lived among them for decades, enforcing local codes and serving as a church leader, was now unmasked as the BTK killer. During interrogations, Rader calmly confessed to the murders, describing them in chilling detail. He showed no remorse, instead speaking about them as projects he had planned and executed. Rader was charged with 10 counts of first-degree murder, though he hinted at more crimes that could not be conclusively proven. In court, he pleaded guilty, giving a long and detailed confession that described each murder step by step. His demeanor was cold and matter-of-fact, horrifying the families of victims who listened in the courtroom. In August 2005, Rader was sentenced to 10 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. He was sent to the El Dorado Correctional Facility in Kansas, where he remains today. His case continues to be studied for the way he maintained a double life, the methods he used to communicate with the public and law enforcement, and the failures and eventual success of the investigation that captured him. The aftermath of the BTK case left lasting scars on Wichita. For decades, families had lived in fear, never knowing who among them might secretly be BTK. The revelation that he was an ordinary neighbor and community leader was almost as terrifying as the crimes themselves. Next story. The story of Eileen Wuornos begins not in the chaos of her crimes, but in the turbulence of her early childhood. She was born in February 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, to a teenage mother and a father who would never play a role in her life. Her father was a convicted child molester who ended up in prison, later taking his own life, and her mother abandoned Eileen and her brother when Eileen was only a toddler. The 2 children were left to the care of their grandparents, a home that was supposed to provide safety, but instead became another environment of instability and abuse. Eileen's grandfather was a violent man, and her grandmother struggled with alcoholism. From an early age, Eileen experienced neglect, violence, and exploitation. By the time she was 11 years old, she had already begun trading sexual favors for food, cigarettes, and small amounts of money, surviving in a world that offered her no protection. She became pregnant as a teenager after being assaulted, and her baby was given up for adoption. Soon after, she was expelled from her home, left to survive entirely on her own. Her teenage years unfolded on the margins of society. She hitchhiked across states, lived outdoors, and engaged in sex work to sustain herself. Eileen's life became a cycle of transient relationships, brushes with the law, and survival through whatever means she could find. She was arrested multiple times for theft, fraud, and disorderly conduct. The years hardened her, stripping away any sense of stability or belonging. By the late 1980s, Wuornos was living in Florida, still drifting and surviving as a sex worker along highways. It was there, beginning in 1989, that her violent crimes began. Unlike many serial killers who targeted specific groups for twisted psychological reasons, Wuornos' murders were bound up with her own life circumstances. She claimed she killed men who had picked her up for sex when they became violent or attempted to assault her. But prosecutors would later argue her crimes were calculated robberies, carried out under the guise of self-defense. Her first known victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old man who picked her up along a Florida highway. In December 1989, his body was discovered abandoned in his car, shot multiple times. At first, the murder seemed like an isolated case, but over the next year, more bodies appeared. The victims were all men, found along roadsides or in wooded areas, killed with a gun, and often robbed of their belongings or vehicles. As the body count rose, eventually reaching 7 confirmed murders, fear spread through Central Florida. Police connected the killings by the consistent method and by witness descriptions of a woman seen with some of the victims shortly before their deaths. A key detail helped narrow the search. Wuornos and her lover, Tyria Moore, had crashed one of the victims' cars and fled the scene, leaving behind fingerprints. Those prints were traced back to Wuornos, already known to law enforcement for her long history of arrests. Investigators began a manhunt, but Wuornos was elusive, moving from cheap motels to bars, living in constant motion. In January 1991, police finally caught her at a biker bar in Daytona Beach. She was arrested without incident, though she maintained a tough and defiant demeanor. Her partner, Tyria Moore, became a crucial figure in the case. Pressured by investigators, Moore agreed to cooperate in exchange for immunity. She called Wuornos while under police surveillance, persuading her to confess to the killings. On tape, Wuornos admitted to several murders, repeating her claim that she acted in self-defense against violent clients. Her trial became a national spectacle. In 1992, she was tried for the murder of Richard Mallory, though evidence from other killings was also introduced. The jury heard not only about the crimes, but also about her troubled past, her years of abandonment and abuse. Yet prosecutors argued that her pattern of taking money, possessions, and cars from her victims showed her true motive. After only a short deliberation, the jury found her guilty of murder, and she was sentenced to death. In the years that followed, Wuornos faced additional trials for the other murders, each ending in further convictions and death sentences. She became one of the rare women on death row in the United States. Her demeanor in court was unpredictable. At times, she appeared calm and resigned. At other times, she lashed out, shouting at the judge, jury, or prosecutors, declaring her hatred for society and her belief that everyone was against her. Wuornos' story drew wide attention, not just because of her crimes, but because of the complicated questions they raised. Some saw her as a victim of abuse and exploitation, a woman who had been failed by every institution meant to protect her, whose violence was an extension of the violence inflicted upon her. Others saw her as a cold-blooded killer who preyed on men and used her history as an excuse. Her life and crimes became the subject of documentaries, books, and eventually the film Monster, which dramatized her story. But behind the media portrayal was a woman who lived nearly her entire life in pain, anger, and alienation. On October 9th, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. She was 46 years old. In her final moments, she gave a rambling statement, referencing outer space, Armageddon, and her belief that she would return. She died quickly, ending a life that had been marked from childhood by violence and instability. The legacy of Aileen Wuornos remains controversial. To some, She symbolizes how cycles of abuse and neglect can create a person capable of great harm. To others, she is remembered simply as a killer who took innocent lives. What is undeniable is that her story stands apart in the history of American crime. A rare example of a female serial killer whose crimes gripped the nation and left behind endless debate about justice, responsibility, and the roots of violence. Her life reminds us how deeply environment and trauma can shape a person, but also how society struggles to reconcile sympathy with accountability. For her victims and their families, the question of motive mattered little compared to the irreversible loss they suffered. For true crime history, the name Aileen Wuornos remains forever etched as both a cautionary tale and a chilling story of violence born from a life of suffering. Next story. The story of John Wayne Gacy begins in the suburbs of Chicago, where he was born in March 1942 to a working-class family. From the outside, his childhood seemed ordinary, but behind closed doors, life was harsh and unforgiving. His father was an alcoholic with a violent temper who regularly belittled and beat him. His mother, though more nurturing, could not shield him from the constant abuse. Gacy grew up desperate for approval, especially from his father, yet he rarely received anything but criticism. As a child, Gacy suffered from health problems, including a heart condition that limited his physical activity. He often felt like an outsider, excluded from sports, and overshadowed by his father's disdain. But beneath his fragile health and troubled home life, Gacy began developing the traits that would later define him: charm, manipulation, and a hunger for recognition. By his teenage years, Gacy began finding ways to fit in socially. He was known as friendly and eager to help, often volunteering for school and community projects. But his personal life already carried shadows. He struggled with his sexuality, something he kept hidden at a time when homosexuality was harshly judged. His need to maintain a public image while concealing his private desires would become a recurring theme throughout his life. In early adulthood, Gacy drifted into sales and business management, where his charisma proved useful. He was ambitious, eager to prove himself, and capable of winning people over. But cracks appeared quickly. In the 1960s, after marrying and moving to Iowa, he was convicted of sexually assaulting a teenage boy. He served time in prison, where he earned a reputation as a model inmate, and was released after serving only a portion of his sentence. His wife divorced him during his incarceration, taking their children and leaving him to start over. When Gacy returned to Illinois, he reinvented himself. He became a contractor, starting his own business and employing local young men. He became active in Democratic Party politics, even posing for photographs with prominent politicians. He volunteered in the community, organizing parties and entertaining children while dressed as Pogo the Clown, a character he created. To neighbors and acquaintances, he seemed generous and dependable, a man who gave back to his community. But behind this mask, Gacy was living a double life of unimaginable horror. From 1972 to 1978, he lured dozens of young men and teenage boys to his home. Some were employees, others were hitchhikers or runaways, and some simply disappeared after meeting him. Once inside, Gacy used various ruses to trap his victims, including a so-called magic trick where he handcuffed them under the pretense of showing them an escape trick. What followed was torture, sexual assault, and murder. The scale of his crimes would not be fully understood until years later. Gacy disposed of many of his victims by burying them in the crawl space beneath his suburban home. When that space became overcrowded, he began discarding bodies in the Des Plaines River. For years, his murders went unnoticed, hidden by his outward image of respectability and civic involvement. Suspicion began to mount in 1978 after the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest, who was last seen leaving work to meet Gacy about a potential job. When police investigated, they quickly connected Gacy to the boy's disappearance. A background check revealed his prior conviction for sexual assault, raising alarm. Detectives began surveillance on Gacy, following him around the clock. As they built their case, they gathered witness statements and evidence linking him to other missing young men. The pressure mounted, and Gacy, increasingly paranoid, began drinking heavily and confiding strange things to friends. In December 1978, police executed a search warrant at Gacy's home. What they found was overwhelming. Beneath the house, investigators uncovered a gruesome burial ground. One body after another was exhumed, eventually totaling 29 victims buried on his property, with additional bodies recovered from the nearby river. The revelations shocked the nation. Gacy, the man who had dressed as a clown for children's parties and mingled with politicians, was now revealed as one of America's most prolific serial killers. The contrast between his public persona and his hidden crimes made the case unforgettable. Gacy was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. His trial began in 1980 and quickly became a media sensation. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, including confessions Gacy had made during interrogation and the remains of victims discovered in his crawl space. The defense attempted to argue that Gacy was insane, claiming he had multiple personalities and that one of them, not the man himself, had committed the murders. The jury was not convinced. After a short deliberation, Gacy was found guilty of 33 counts of murder, one of the highest confirmed victim counts for a single killer in the United States. He was sentenced to death. For more than a decade, Gacy remained on death row, filing appeals and granting interviews. In these interviews, he alternated between admitting guilt, denying involvement, and even blaming others. He painted himself as a scapegoat, a victim of lies, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. On May 10, 1994, Gacy was executed by lethal injection. His final meal consisted of fried chicken, shrimp, and strawberries, and his final words were defiant, a reflection of the arrogance that had marked much of his life. The legacy of John Wayne Gacy is one of horror and betrayal. He was a man who hid his darkest crimes behind the painted smile of a clown, deceiving his community while committing acts of unspeakable violence. His case forced Americans to confront the uncomfortable truth that evil can lurk behind the most ordinary of facades, that a man who entertains children can also be capable of burying their peers beneath his own home. The Gacy murders remain a landmark case in American criminal history, a chilling reminder of how deception and cruelty can coexist within one person. For the families of his victims, the story is not about the bizarre details of his double life, but about the young lives cut short and the years of pain that followed. Even today, the name John Wayne Gacy evokes both fear and fascination, a symbol of hidden darkness and the limits of trust. His crawl space became a graveyard, his home a house of horrors, and his name one of the most infamous in the history of crime. Next story. The story of Richard Ramirez begins on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas. He was the youngest of 5 children in a working-class Mexican-American family. From early childhood, Ramirez's life was scarred by violence and instability. His father, a former police officer in Mexico turned laborer in the United States, had a harsh temper. He frequently lashed out at his children, instilling fear rather than guidance. Richard was different from the start, prone to seizures and suffering from head injuries after repeated blows to the head. He struggled in school and became withdrawn. As a boy, he often slept in cemeteries to escape his father's wrath, finding comfort in the stillness of the night. But what might have been a shy, troubled boy soon began sliding towards something darker. A major influence in Ramirez's life was his older cousin, Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran who returned home deeply scarred by combat. Miguel shared stories of brutal violence and even showed Richard photographs of Vietnamese women he claimed to have assaulted and killed. He glorified cruelty, and to a young Richard, these stories became lessons rather than warnings. When Richard was just 13, he witnessed Miguel shoot and kill his own wife during a domestic argument. Instead of recoiling from the horror, Ramirez seemed fascinated, absorbing it as part of his twisted education. By his teenage years, Ramirez had begun experimenting with drugs, particularly marijuana and LSD, while developing an obsession with Satanism. He gravitated toward darker influences in music, art, and literature. Petty crime became a routine, and he eventually dropped out of high school. He left Texas for California, where he slipped into a transient lifestyle of theft, drugs, and aimlessness. But behind the theft and wandering, a darker compulsion was growing, a drive for violence and domination. In 1984, Ramirez began what would become one of the most terrifying crime sprees in American history. His first known murder occurred that June, when he attacked a 79-year-old woman in her apartment, stabbing her repeatedly. Soon, his crimes escalated. Unlike many killers who targeted a specific type of victim, Ramirez attacked randomly. His victims included men, women, and children, ranging from young girls to elderly couples. He would break into homes at night, assault his victims, commit sexual violence, and often kill them with knives or guns. The randomness of his crimes made him uniquely terrifying. No neighborhood felt safe. Families locked their doors, bolted their windows, and slept in fear. The press began calling him the Night Stalker, a name that stuck and magnified the sense of dread. Ramirez reveled in the fear he created. During his attacks, he invoked Satan, leaving behind symbols and shouting phrases that amplified his image as a disciple of evil. He often forced his victims to swear loyalty to Satan or mock their faith. His methods were cruel and chaotic, sometimes shooting his victims, sometimes stabbing them, sometimes bludgeoning them. Survivors described him as tall, thin, with rotting teeth, smelling of decay, and having eyes that radiated menace. By the summer of 1985, California was in a panic. Ramirez's attacks stretched across Los Angeles and later into the San Francisco Bay Area. Communities set up neighborhood watches, police patrols increased, and gun sales soared. The randomness of his crimes left investigators scrambling. But Ramirez made mistakes. He left fingerprints, shoe prints, and eyewitness descriptions. A stolen car he abandoned eventually gave police the evidence they needed. In August 1985, his fingerprint was matched to a prior arrest record, and his identity was released to the public. His mugshot was printed on the front pages of newspapers across California. Only days later, Ramirez walked into a convenience store in East Los Angeles and realized that everyone around him recognized his face. Panicked, he tried to steal a car and escape, but the local community chased him down. In a dramatic moment of street justice, a mob of citizens beat and restrained him until police arrived. The reign of the Night Stalker had ended, not at the hands of detectives, but by ordinary people who refused to let him escape. Ramirez was put on trial in 1989 for 13 murders, as well as charges of attempted murder, sexual assault, and burglary. The trial was a media circus, drawing massive crowds. Ramirez appeared in court with long hair, dark sunglasses, and a pentagram drawn on his hand, shouting, "Hail Satan." His behavior shocked many, reinforcing the image of a man who embraced evil as an identity. The trial dragged on for years due to its complexity and the number of charges. Survivors and families of victims gave heart-wrenching testimony. Forensic evidence tied Ramirez directly to multiple crimes. Despite his lawyer's attempts, the jury found him guilty on all major counts. On September 20th, 1989, Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death. Upon hearing the sentence, he sneered and told the court that death was nothing compared to the forces he served, declaring that the real terror would come later. Ramirez was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he remained on death row for more than 2 decades. During his imprisonment, he developed a following of admirers, some drawn to his notoriety, others captivated by his embrace of Satanism. In 1996, he even married a freelance magazine editor who had become obsessed with him. But his life ended not with execution, but with illness. On June 7th, 2013, at the age of 53, Richard Ramirez died of complications related to lymphoma while still awaiting execution. The Night Stalker case remains one of the most infamous in American history. Ramirez's crimes were not only about murder, but about terror itself. Striking randomly, violating the sanctity of homes, and leaving behind communities paralyzed with fear. He embodied the nightmare of a predator who could come for anyone, at any time, without reason or pattern. For Californians who lived through that summer of 1985, the memory of locking doors, checking windows, and listening for noises in the dark remains vivid. Richard Ramirez left scars not only on his victims and their families, but on an entire state that lived under his shadow. His name has since become synonymous with pure, predatory evil. The case of Jeffrey Dahmer remains one of the darkest chapters in modern crime history. Born in May 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Jeffrey grew up in a home that was outwardly normal but internally fractured. His father, Lionel, was a research chemist, and his mother, Joyce, battled her own struggles with mental health. From a young age, Jeffrey displayed signs of detachment from those around him. He was shy, withdrawn, and often preferred to be alone. What stood out to those who later reflected on his youth was a fascination with the dead and with animals in particular. Jeffrey would collect roadkill, study the bodies, and experiment with their bones. At the time, these habits were dismissed as odd, but not alarming enough to demand intervention. As Jeffrey entered his teenage years, his isolation deepened. Alcohol became his companion. He began drinking heavily, even during school hours, hiding liquor in the folds of his clothing or stashing it in lockers. His classmates sometimes laughed about it, but his drinking was a symptom of a deeper emptiness that was consuming him. He felt disconnected from people. At the same time, Jeffrey was beginning to struggle with his own sexual identity, and he later admitted that his urges were mixed with fantasies of control and domination. The pivotal moment that marked his first descent into murder came in June 1978, shortly after his high school graduation. His parents had separated, and Jeffrey was left alone in the family home. One evening, he picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. Stephen was a young man heading to a rock concert, and he accepted Jeffrey's invitation to stop at the house for some drinks. At first, the atmosphere was friendly, but as the night wore on, Jeffrey realized that Stephen wanted to leave. Panic and desperation filled him because Jeffrey did not want to be alone again. He struck Stephen with a dumbbell and strangled him. This was the first murder. Afterward, Jeffrey dismembered the body and disposed of it in the woods behind the house. This act haunted him, but it also awakened something inside him that he would later admit he could not control. In the years that followed, Jeffrey tried to appear normal. He briefly attended Ohio State University, but dropped out after only a few months. His drinking worsened, and his father forced him to enlist in the Army in 1979. Jeffrey trained as a medic in Germany. While stationed overseas, he continued to drink excessively. Some later reports suggested that he may have assaulted fellow soldiers, though these cases were never pursued in detail at the time. By 1981, he was discharged for his inability to function. With no stable direction, Jeffrey drifted between relatives and odd jobs. By the late 1980s, his impulses returned stronger. Living in Milwaukee in a small apartment, Jeffrey began frequenting gay bars and bathhouses. At first, he sought companionship, but his fear of abandonment twisted these encounters. He started drugging men to keep them unconscious during their encounters. Eventually, this progressed into murder once again. In 1987, he killed Stephen Twomey in a hotel room after a night of drinking. Jeffrey later claimed he awoke to find Stephen dead without memory of killing him, but this pattern of blackout, followed by violence, would repeat. Over the next 4 years, Dahmer embarked on a spree that would claim 16 more lives. His method was chillingly systematic. He lured young men and boys, often from marginalized communities, with promises of money or photographs. Once inside his apartment, he drugged them, strangled them, and kept their bodies for days. In some cases, he performed disturbing rituals of dismemberment and cannibalism. He kept skulls and body parts as trophies, storing them in his refrigerator in a blue barrel filled with acid. His obsession was not only with killing, but with creating a permanent companion who could never leave him. He attempted crude experiments of drilling holes into the skulls of victims and injecting chemicals in hopes of creating a compliant zombie-like partner. Despite the horror unfolding inside his apartment, Jeffrey remained surprisingly unnoticed. Several near escapes highlight the tragic failures of authorities. One of the most striking occurred in May 1991 when a 14-year-old boy named Konarak, sent the some phone, managed to flee Jeffrey's apartment drugged and bleeding. Neighbors called police when they saw the boy wandering incoherently. Officers arrived, but Jeffrey convinced them that Konarak was his adult lover and that it was a private matter. The police accepted this explanation and left the boy in Jeffrey's custody. Within an hour, Jeffrey had killed him. These failures allowed Dahmer to continue his crimes until July 22nd, 1991, when another intended victim, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape. Edwards was lured to the apartment, but once inside, he noticed the smell and saw the strange surroundings. Jeffrey attempted to handcuff him, but Edwards fought back and fled through the door. He stopped police officers on patrol and led them back to the apartment. When police entered, they discovered photographs of dismembered bodies, and soon after, the full extent of Jeffrey's actions was revealed. The arrest shocked the nation. Neighbors who had complained of foul smells and odd noises were horrified to learn what had been happening next door. The investigation uncovered remains of multiple victims, as well as the tools and containers Jeffrey had used. His calm demeanor during questioning unsettled investigators. He openly admitted to the murders, describing his rituals in clinical detail. For the families of the victims, the revelations were devastating. Many of them were already living in difficult social and economic circumstances and now had to endure the public exposure of their loved ones' deaths. The trial began in January 1992 and drew international attention. Jeffrey pleaded guilty but insane. His defense argued that his mental illness drove his uncontrollable urges. The prosecution maintained that he knew exactly what he was doing and that he carefully planned his actions. After weeks of testimony, including graphic evidence, the jury found him guilty on 15 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms totaling nearly 1,000 years in prison. Prison did not bring peace. Jeffrey initially lived quietly behind bars, reading the Bible and speaking to chaplains. Yet other inmates viewed him with contempt. He sometimes mocked guards and prisoners by shaping his food into body parts, as if to relive his crimes. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer was attacked by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver. Scarver beat him to death in the prison bathroom. For many families, this ending felt like a final chapter, though it could never erase the pain. The legacy of Jeffrey Dahmer continues to stir debates about mental illness policing and the vulnerability of marginalized groups. His crimes revealed systemic failures in law enforcement, who dismissed the concerns of neighbors and ignored the pleas of victims. It showed how predators can hide in plain sight, while institutions fail to protect those most at risk. Documentaries and books continue to analyze the case, but beyond the sensationalism lies the human cost. 17 lives were lost, each with families who still mourn. Story 2. Ted Bundy remains a name etched into the darkest pages of criminal history. Born in November 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, Theodore Robert Bundy grew up in an environment of secrets. His mother, Eleanor, raised him with the support of her strict parents. For a time, Ted believed his grandparents were his parents and his mother was his sister. The truth of his parentage remained confusing, and he grew up with an undercurrent of instability. Despite this, outwardly, he appeared intelligent, polite, and even charming. As a young boy, Bundy displayed early signs of detachment and fascination with control. Neighbors recalled that he sometimes placed knives around his aunt as she slept. He also developed a habit of peeping into windows and stealing items from homes. Still, these warning signs went largely unnoticed. He was a good student and seemed socially adept. Teachers saw him as quiet and well-mannered. In the 1960s, Bundy attended the University of Washington in Seattle. There he studied psychology and became politically active, volunteering for campaigns and working a crisis hotline. Colleagues at the hotline would later recall his calm voice and apparent empathy for callers in distress. Nobody suspected that he was already harboring violent fantasies. Bundy's murders began in the early 1970s, though it is believed he may have killed earlier. He targeted young women, often students who resembled a former girlfriend he felt deeply rejected by. He would approach them in public places pretending to be injured or in need of help. Sometimes he wore a sling or used crutches. When kind strangers offered assistance, he would lead them to a secluded area and attack. His earliest confirmed victims were in Washington state. In 1974, a series of disappearances began to alarm police. Women vanished from college campuses, leaving little trace. One of the first was Linda, an Healy student at the University of Washington who disappeared from her home in January 1974. That summer, two women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, disappeared on the same day from Lake Sammamish State Park. Witnesses described a handsome man with a cast on his arm asking women to help him load a sailboat. He introduced himself as Ted. This was one of the first times investigators had a name. Bundy's ability to charm and deceive allowed him to evade suspicion. He continued his studies, even attending law school. Outwardly, he dated women, maintained friendships, and volunteered in politics. Yet beneath this mask, his killings escalated. He abducted, raped, and murdered women across multiple states, including Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. His method was consistent. He lured victims often at night, assaulted them, and killed them usually by strangulation or bludgeoning. He sometimes revisited the bodies, leaving them in remote wooded areas, and in some cases committing acts of necrophilia. By 1975, Bundy had moved to Utah, and killings began there as well. Local investigators grew alarmed at the pattern. He was eventually arrested that year after police found burglary tools in his car, which also contained suspicious items like handcuffs and a ski mask. At the time, this evidence was not enough for a murder charge, but it marked the beginning of his downfall. Bundy managed to escape custody multiple times, which only added to his infamy. In 1977, while held in Colorado, he leapt from a courthouse library window and fled. He was recaptured, but later that year, he escaped again from his jail cell by squeezing through a hole in the ceiling. He made his way across the country to Florida. In Florida, Bundy unleashed his most brutal attacks. In January 1978, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University. In the early hours of the morning, he attacked 4 women in their rooms, killing 2 of them, Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman, and severely injuring the others. Only weeks later, he abducted and murdered a 12-year-old girl named Kimberly Leach. These crimes shocked the nation and ended any illusion that Bundy was a man who could restrain himself. His capture came soon after. In February 1978, he was pulled over by police in Pensacola driving a stolen car. Once identified, his face was splashed across newspapers nationwide. The trial that followed was the first to be televised, and millions watched as Bundy attempted to defend himself in court. He cross-examined witnesses and played the role of his own lawyer. His charm and arrogance fascinated the media, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Bite mark analysis tied him to the Chi Omega murders, and witnesses placed him near the scenes. In 1979, Bundy was convicted and sentenced to death. Additional trials followed for the murder of Kimberly Leach, and he received another death sentence. Over the next decade, he lived on death row in Florida, appealing his case and granting interviews. During this time, he confessed to more than 30 murders, though investigators believe the true number may be higher, possibly over 100. Bundy described in chilling detail how he selected and killed his victims. In January 1989, his appeals ran out, and he was executed in the electric chair at Florida State Prison. Outside, the prison crowds gathered, chanting and celebrating the end of his life. For many families, the execution closed a painful chapter, though the scars of loss remain. The legacy of Ted Bundy endures because his crimes revealed how easily appearances can deceive. He was educated, articulate, and outwardly normal, yet beneath that facade lay a predator driven by compulsion. His case led to greater awareness of a need for coordinated police work across states, since Bundy moved freely between jurisdictions. It also highlighted the vulnerability of young women who trusted a stranger in need. Today, Bundy is remembered not only for his crimes, but also for the way society responded to him. The media often portrayed him as charismatic, which drew criticism for humanizing him instead of focusing on the victims. Books, documentaries, and films continue to analyze his life, but at the core remained the stories of the women whose lives were stolen. They were daughters, sisters, and friends who deserve remembrance beyond the shadow of the man who killed them. Bundy's story is one of deception, manipulation, and cruelty wrapped in the mask of normalcy. It endures as a warning that evil can sometimes wear the most ordinary face. Story 3. John Wayne Gacy was born in March 1942 in Chicago, Illinois. He grew up in a working-class family with a father who was an alcoholic and physically abusive. His childhood was marked by fear and insecurity. Though he tried to please his father, nothing ever seemed enough. He suffered from health problems, including a heart condition that limited his activities. These early years shaped a man who longed for acceptance, but carried deep resentment and anger inside. Despite a difficult home life, Gacy worked hard to present himself as normal. In high school, he was not particularly athletic, but he participated in clubs and worked odd jobs. He developed an early interest in politics and community activities. After leaving school, he married and tried to build a stable life. For a time, he seemed successful. He managed several fast food restaurants and became involved in local organizations. His outward personality was friendly and generous. He hosted neighborhood gatherings and was known to dress as a clown named Pogo to entertain children at hospitals and community events. This image of the cheerful neighbor and community volunteer would later stand in sharp contrast to the darkness he hid. Beneath the mask of normalcy, Gacy was leading a double life. He had already faced accusations of assaulting young men in the 1960s while living in Iowa. He was convicted of sexually abusing a teenage boy in 1968 and sentenced to prison. Though he served less than 2 years, he returned to Chicago with a record that should have been a warning. Instead, he managed to rebuild his reputation. He remarried, started his own construction business, and became active in local politics. He was even photographed with prominent politicians. To the public, he was a respected businessman. To those closest to him, there were glimpses of volatility, but few suspected the horror that lay hidden. Gacy's crimes escalated in the early 1970s. He lured young men and boys to his home, often offering them work construction jobs or simply a safe place to hang out. Once inside his modest suburban house, he would overpower them. His method became ritualistic. He used handcuffs, sometimes presenting them as a party trick. After restraining his victims, he would assault, torture, and eventually strangle them. Most of the killings took place in his home while his neighbors remained unaware. The number of victims grew over the years. Gacy buried many of them in the crawl space beneath his house. Others were disposed of in nearby rivers. The smell in the house became overwhelming at times, but Gacy explained it away as plumbing issues. He continued to maintain his outward image of normality, attending parties, working in politics, and performing as Pogo the Clown. The juxtaposition between his community role and his secret life made the eventual revelation all the more shocking. In 1978, his crimes began to unravel. That December, a teenage boy named Robert Pius disappeared after telling friends he was going to meet a contractor about a job. The contractor was John Wayne Gacy. When police began investigating, they quickly connected Gacy to other missing young men. They obtained a search warrant and entered his house. Inside, they found items that belonged to several missing victims. The stench from the crawl space raised immediate suspicions. A second search warrant allowed police to dig beneath the house. What they uncovered was a nightmare. Body after body was exhumed from the crawl space. In total, 29 victims were buried there, with additional remains found in rivers nearby. Many of the victims were teenagers or young men who had simply vanished without explanation. For families who had searched desperately for answers, the discovery was devastating. Gacy was arrested and interrogated. His demeanor shocked investigators. He confessed calmly to more than 30 murders, describing his methods in chilling detail. He admitted that he had sometimes killed 2 victims in a single night. He spoke of the killings as though they were routine parts of his life. His lack of remorse and the sheer scale of his crimes stunned even seasoned detectives. The trial of John Wayne Gacy began in 1980. It attracted enormous attention. Prosecutors laid out the evidence of his double life and the brutality of his murders. The defense attempted to argue insanity, but the jury was unconvinced. The calculated nature of his crimes and his ability to maintain a normal outward life demonstrated that he understood his actions. After only a short deliberation, the jury found him guilty on 33 counts of murder. It was one of the largest conviction totals for a single person in American history at the time. Gacy was sentenced to death. He spent 14 years on death row at Menard Correctional Center in Illinois. During this time, he painted hundreds of portraits, many of them depicting clowns. These paintings were sometimes sold at auctions, sparking controversy. Gacy gave interviews in which he denied responsibility despite his earlier confessions. He claimed he was the victim of a conspiracy. His shifting stories only added to his notoriety. On May 10, 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Outside, the prison crowds gathered in celebration. For many families, the execution brought some closure, though nothing could restore the lives that were lost. The sheer scale of his crimes left a permanent scar on the communities he had haunted. The case of John Wayne Gacy continues to resonate because of the contrast between his public and private lives. He was the friendly neighbor, the businessman, the clown who entertained children, yet behind closed doors, he was a predator who murdered more than 30 young men. His ability to hide in plain sight exposed flaws in the system and highlighted how vulnerable runaway teens and young workers were in the 1970s. The legacy of Gacy is one of horror and deception. His crimes serve as a reminder that appearances can be misleading and that predators can exist even in the most ordinary neighborhoods. The memory of his victims endures as a testament to lives cut short by a man who wore a mask, both literal and figurative. Behind the smile of a clown lay the heart of a killer. Story 4. The Zodiac Killer is a name that still casts a shadow over the history of American crime. Active in the late 1960s and early 1970s in Northern California, the Zodiac terrorized communities with brutal murders and cryptic letters. Unlike many other killers, his identity was never confirmed, which has only deepened the mystery and fear surrounding the case. The first confirmed attack attributed to the Zodiac occurred on December 20th, 1968, near the small town of Benicia, California. Two teenagers, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, were on their first date when they parked at a lover's lane spot. A car pulled up beside them. The assailant forced them out and shot both of them with a handgun. Betty Lou died instantly, and David was mortally wounded. There was no robbery or clear motive. It seemed a senseless act. Investigators had few leads, and the case went cold. On July 4th, 1969, another couple, Darlene Farron and Mike Mageau, were sitting in a car at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo when a vehicle pulled up. The driver left, then returned and opened fire with a handgun. Darlene was killed, and Mike survived with serious injuries. Just over an hour later, a man called the Vallejo police station claiming responsibility not only for this attack, but also for the previous one on David and Betty Lou. The caller provided details that had not been released publicly. It was the first direct communication from the man who would call himself the Zodiac. Weeks later, newspapers received letters written by the killer. These letters were taunting, filled with strange symbols and coded messages. In one, he introduced himself with the chilling phrase, "This is the Zodiac speaking." He demanded that the letters be published or he would kill more people. Inside the letters were cryptograms that he claimed revealed his identity. One of the first ciphers was cracked by a schoolteacher and his wife. It did not reveal a name, but instead a disturbing message where the killer declared that he enjoyed killing because it was fun. The Zodiac struck again on September 27, 1969 at Lake Berryessa. Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard were relaxing by the water when a man approached wearing a hood with a crosshair symbol on the chest. He tied them up and stabbed them repeatedly. Brian survived, but Cecilia later died. Before leaving the scene, the attacker scrawled a message on the victim's car door with the dates of his previous attacks and his distinctive crosshair symbol. Only 2 weeks later, on October 11th, 1969, the Zodiac murdered cab driver Paul Stein in San Francisco. He shot him in the head and then bizarrely cut a piece of the victim's shirt to send later with a letter. Witnesses saw the killer at the scene, describing him as a white male in his 30s with glasses. Despite this near Miss the Zodiac managed to escape into the night. Police rushed to the area, but confusion about the suspect's race led officers to let him walk past them. This mistake may have cost them their best chance at capture. Over the following years, the Zodiac continued to send letters to newspapers and police. In them, he mocked investigators, boasted about his crimes, and threatened mass killings. He claimed responsibility for dozens of murders, though only a handful have been definitively linked to him. The letters often included ciphers, some of which remain unsolved to this day. His messages revealed a man who craved attention and control more than anything. He wanted to be feared and to prove that he was smarter than the authorities. The investigation into the Zodiac was massive. Police departments across multiple counties worked together, but cooperation was strained at times. Thousands of tips poured in and hundreds of suspects were investigated. The most famous suspect was Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted child molester who lived in Vallejo and matched some descriptions. He was interviewed multiple times and even named in a search warrant. Circumstantial evidence pointed toward him, but definitive proof never surfaced. DNA analysis years later did not match him, though doubts and debates remain. As time passed, the Zodiac's letters grew less frequent. His last confirmed correspondence was in 1974. After that, the trail went cold. Some believe he died or was imprisoned for another crime. Others think he simply stopped writing and continued living quietly under a false identity. The lack of closure left victims' families and investigators frustrated. In the decades since the killings, the Zodiac has become part of American folklore. Books, documentaries, and films have kept the story alive. Amateur sleuths have dedicated their lives to decoding his ciphers and piecing together clues. In 2020, a team of codebreakers finally solved one of his unsolved ciphers sent in 1969. The message contained more taunts, but again, no name. This reinforced the idea that the Zodiac never intended to reveal his identity. His goal was to manipulate the public and instill fear. The impact of the Zodiac case was profound. It highlighted the challenges of interagency cooperation in the pre-digital era, when communication between counties was slow. It showed how media attention could both aid and hinder investigations. The constant publication of his letters gave him the spotlight he desired, but also kept the public informed. To this day, the identity of the Zodiac remains unproven. DNA analysis offers some hope, but the evidence is limited and degraded by time. Theories abound, ranging from known suspects like Arthur Lee Allen to more obscure figures. Every few years, a new claim emerges about his identity, but none have been confirmed. The story of the Zodiac killer endures because it combines brutal violence with mystery. Unlike other serial killers who were eventually caught and exposed, the Zodiac remains a ghost figure lurking in the shadows of history. His victims were ordinary people, young couples enjoying evenings by the water, or a cab driver working late at night. Their lives were cut short by a man who wanted to be remembered for terror rather than for who he was. Today, more than 50 years later, the case continues to fascinate because it is unfinished. The unanswered questions leave space for endless speculation. The Zodiac's cryptic symbols remain as haunting reminders of a killer who manipulated fear with both weapons and words. His legacy is not only in the murders he committed, but in the way he exploited mystery itself, turning crime into a dark puzzle that is yet to be solved. Story 5. Richard Ramirez was born in February 1960 in El Paso, Texas. His childhood was marked by instability and violence. His father was strict and often abusive. His mother worked in a factory where exposure to chemicals may have affected her health. Richard grew up surrounded by poverty and dysfunction. From a young age, he was influenced by his older cousin Miguel, who had returned from serving in Vietnam. Miguel boasted about brutal acts he had committed during the war and even showed Richard disturbing photographs of women he claimed to have assaulted. At only 12 years old, Richard witnessed Miguel murder his own wife during a domestic argument. These traumatic experiences left deep scars on the boy, who was already vulnerable. Richard began experimenting with drugs as a teenager, turning to marijuana and later LSD. He also developed a fascination with Satanism and dark rituals. He struggled in school and dropped out early. His petty crimes soon escalated into burglaries. By his early 20s, he had moved to California, drifting through Los Angeles and San Francisco, surviving on theft and immersing himself in a lifestyle of addiction and violence. His descent into murder began in 1984. That June, a 79-year-old woman named Jenny Vinkow was found dead in her apartment in Los Angeles. She had been stabbed, and her body showed signs of mutilation. Police had no suspect at the time, but years later this crime was linked to Richard Ramirez. It marked the start of his killing spree. By 1985, the murders escalated dramatically. Ramirez gained the nickname the Night Stalker because he attacked in the middle of the night. He targeted homes across Southern California, breaking in while victims slept. His methods were unpredictable. Sometimes he used a gun, other times a knife or blunt objects. He killed men and women of all ages. He assaulted women and sometimes children. He left satanic symbols at crime scenes and forced victims to swear their loyalty to the devil. The randomness of his attacks created widespread fear because nobody knew who might be next. In March 1985, he attacked Maria Hernandez in her home in Rosemead. She survived by raising her hands and deflecting a bullet. Minutes later, he killed another woman, Tsai, Lian outside her car nearby. That same evening, he killed a third woman in her apartment. These rapid attacks terrified the city. Newspapers began covering the Night Stalker daily. Over the next months, Ramirez continued his spree. He invaded homes across Los Angeles and beyond, often leaving survivors who could describe his appearance. He was tall, thin, with rotting teeth and a foul odor that witnesses never forgot. His brutality shocked even seasoned detectives. In some cases, he forced couples to witness each other's assaults before killing one or both. He showed no consistent pattern except his desire to terrorize. The police struggled to catch him. At first, the crime seemed unrelated because of the varying weapons and methods. But soon detectives connected the attacks by shoe prints left behind. A distinct sneaker pattern linked multiple scenes. The media reported on this detail, which angered investigators because Ramirez could have changed his shoes to avoid detection. Still, the clue remained vital. By the summer of 1985, his crimes reached a peak. He attacked in San Francisco, killing Peter and Barbara Pan in their home. The mayor of San Francisco publicly revealed that the killer used a .22 caliber handgun. Ramirez read the papers constantly and adjusted his tactics to confuse police. But mistakes piled up. Survivors gave detailed descriptions, and eventually a fingerprint was lifted from a stolen car he abandoned. Police matched it to Richard Ramirez, who already had a record for theft and drug charges. On August 31st, 1985, Ramirez was finally captured, but not by police at first. His photograph had been released to the public, and when he attempted to steal a car in East Los Angeles, he was recognized. Neighbors chased him through the streets and cornered him. The crowd beat him until police arrived to take him into custody. The capture brought relief to a city that had been living in fear for months. The trial of Richard Ramirez became one of the most notorious in American history. It began in 1989 and lasted over a year. The courtroom was often filled with reporters and curious spectators. Ramirez seemed to revel in the attention. He flashed satanic hand signs and shouted "Hail Satan" during proceedings. His gaunt appearance, dark eyes, and defiant attitude made him a figure of morbid fascination. Despite his behavior, the evidence was overwhelming. Survivors testified in detail. Forensic evidence, including fingerprints and ballistic matches, tied him to multiple murders. In September 1989, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, as well as numerous counts of assault, burglary, and attempted murder. He was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin prison. Outside the courthouse, crowds cheered the verdict. Families of victims wept both in grief and in relief that justice had been served. On death row, Ramirez continued to attract media attention. He received letters from admirers and even married a woman who believed in his innocence. His presence remained unsettling. Unlike some killers who eventually expressed remorse, he showed none. He continued to speak about Satanism and portrayed himself as an outcast who had embraced evil. Ramirez never faced execution. He remained on death row for more than 2 decades. In June 2013, he died of complications related to cancer at the age of 53. For some, the fact that he died of natural causes rather than execution was frustrating, but his death finally closed the chapter on his life. The legacy of the Night Stalker remains one of pure terror. His crimes were random, cruel, and driven not by need, but by desire to spread fear. Unlike killers who targeted specific types of victims, Ramirez attacked anyone he encountered. This unpredictability magnified the panic in California communities. People began locking doors, installing new security systems, and staying awake at night terrified that he might strike. His story highlights the vulnerability of ordinary homes and the way one man can paralyze entire cities. The survivors of his attacks continue to carry the memories of those nights. The families of the dead live with the loss of loved ones whose lives were cut short in acts of senseless brutality. Richard Ramirez remains a reminder of the darkest extremes of human behavior. He called himself a servant of Satan, but in reality, he was a predator who preyed on the innocent. His name and the moniker Night Stalker endure in American memory as symbols of fear that once gripped a generation. Story 6. In the quiet rural town of Plainfield, Wisconsin, during the first half of the 20th century, life moved slowly and simply. The community was small, neighbors knew one another, and farms stretched across the flat landscape. Yet behind this peaceful setting there lived a man whose crimes would eventually horrify the entire nation. His name was Edward Theodore Gain. Ed Gain was born in August 1906 to George and Augusta Gain. His father was an alcoholic who struggled to hold steady work, while his mother was deeply religious, domineering, and strict. Augusta instilled in her 2 sons a belief that the world was filled with sin and corruption. She particularly warned them against women, describing them as instruments of immorality. Ed grew up isolated. The family rarely allowed social interaction, and the Gain children were discouraged from making friends. As a child, Ed was shy, quiet, and awkward. He was ridiculed by other children at school, which only pushed him further into isolation. His mother's teachings shaped him profoundly. He developed an unhealthy attachment to Augusta, viewing her as the only pure and trustworthy person in the world. This dependence would define his entire life. In 1940, Ed's father died, leaving the family to survive on farm income. Soon after, his older brother Henry began expressing doubts about their mother's strict worldview. Henry worried about Ed's unhealthy devotion to Augusta, but in 1944 Henry died in a suspicious fire while working on the family property. Although the official cause was listed as asphyxiation, investigators quietly noted that the circumstances were odd. Ed reported the fire, and when Henry's body was found, it appeared not badly burned, leading some to wonder if Ed had played a role in his brother's death. After Henry's passing, Ed was left alone with his mother. But only a year later, in 1945, Augusta herself died following a series of strokes. Her death devastated Ed. He had lost the one person who dominated his world and provided structure to his life. Without her guidance, he became reclusive, retreating into the farmhouse that grew increasingly filthy and cluttered. Most rooms were left untouched as shrines to Augusta, kept exactly as she had left them, while Ed confined himself to a few areas filled with debris and decay. It was in this lonely environment that Ed's obsession with death and the human body began to take its most disturbing form. He frequently visited cemeteries at night, digging up recently buried bodies. He removed skin, bones, and organs, taking them back to his farmhouse where he fashioned grotesque trophies. Investigators later discovered masks made of human skin, bowls crafted from skulls, and furniture upholstered with human hides. These creations suggested that Ed was attempting to recreate his mother's presence or even become her by wearing the skin of women he exhumed. For many years, his macabre activities went unnoticed. Plainfield was a small, trusting community, and Ed was seen as odd but harmless. He worked odd jobs, babysat for neighbors, and was known for being polite though strange. That perception changed in November 1957 when Bernice Wardens, the local hardware store owner, disappeared. Her store was found locked with bloodstains on the floor. A receipt showed that Ed Gain had been her last customer that day. Police obtained a search warrant and went to Ed's farmhouse. What they found shocked even the most experienced officers. Inside the house were the remains of Bernice Wardens. Her body had been hung in a shed and gutted like a deer. As investigators searched further, they uncovered the horrific collection of human remains Ed had gathered over the years. Masks of human faces hung on the walls. Chairs were covered in human skin, and boxes contained organs. Some remains were traced back to missing women, though Ed admitted many came from graves he had robbed. The discoveries horrified the public. The idea that a quiet, seemingly harmless neighbor had been committing such grotesque acts shattered the sense of safety in small-town America. Newspapers across the country printed the details, and Ed Gain quickly became infamous. His crimes went beyond murder into a realm of depravity rarely seen. During interrogation, Ed confessed to killing Bernice Wardens and another local woman, tavern owner Mary Hogan, who had vanished in 1954. He also admitted to robbing graves, but claimed he had not killed most of the women whose remains were found in his house. His statements revealed a disturbed mind. He described entering trances when digging up bodies, and he explained how he crafted clothing and masks in an effort to transform himself into his mother. In 1958, Ed Gain was found mentally incompetent to stand trial and was committed to a psychiatric institution. For more than a decade, he remained there until doctors declared him fit for trial. In 1968, he was tried for the murder of Bernice Wardens. He was found guilty but insane, leading to his return to a mental hospital where he spent the remainder of his life. He died in 1984 at the age of 77. The case of Ed Gain left a lasting legacy not only in true crime history, but also in popular culture. His crimes inspired some of the most iconic horror characters in cinema, including Norman Bates in Psycho, Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs. His story raised questions about mental illness, isolation, and the dangers of unchecked obsession. For the people of Plainfield, the scars never fully healed. The town became associated with darkness it never asked for. Many locals avoided speaking about Ed Gain for decades, wishing to move past the horror. Yet the farmhouse where he committed his crimes became a site of morbid curiosity until it was eventually burned down. Ed Gain remains a figure of fascination because his crimes blurred the line between reality and nightmare. He was not the typical killer driven by greed or impulse. Instead, he was a man shaped by isolation, dominated by his mother, and consumed by fantasies that grew more grotesque after her death. His actions shocked a nation because they revealed what can emerge from loneliness and obsession left unchecked. Even today, his story is studied in criminal psychology as an example of how trauma, control, and mental illness can twist a life into something almost unimaginable. Behind every horror film inspired by his deeds is the reminder that these terrors were once real in a small Wisconsin town where people thought they knew their neighbors.